She was fired in front of a room full of silent strangers, because she dared to serve a hot meal to a man in uniform who could barely stand, soaked to the bone, his hands shaking as he whispered for nothing more than hot water and a crust of bread. Emily Carter didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't even blink. She simply untied her apron with trembling fingers and walked out into the rain, spine straight, dignity intact. What she didn't know was that the man she fed had once carried a wounded soldier through 3 miles of enemy fire. And that soldier, now a colonel, was already on his way. The next morning, 200 soldiers stood outside that same diner. And this time, they weren't asking for coffee. In a world quick to shame and slow to see, one quiet act of kindness can echo louder than any uniform, any title, any law. If you've ever believed that honor isn't about medals, but about doing what's right when no one else will, keep watching. Comment honor if you still believe dignity has a place in this world. And stay with us if your heart still stands at attention for the ones who do good quietly. Emily Carter was 34, but the weight in her shoulders added quiet decades her birth certificate never knew. She had soft auburn hair always tied back too tightly, as if restraint could keep the day from spilling over. Her skin was pale from the early shifts, her frame lean from skipped meals, and her eyes, gray like low-hanging clouds, watched everything without ever asking to be seen. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was soft and even, like a hymn sung from memory. People in Haddonfield said she was polite, dependable, quiet. But what they really meant was invisible. Every morning at 5:15, she rose without an alarm, folded her blanket into perfect corners, fed her one-eyed tabby cat Dusty, and walked 3 blocks to Doyle's diner, rain or shine, snow or summer. She brewed the first pot of coffee before sunrise, wiped the same counter 3 times a day, and never once left without restocking the napkins. That was her world, measured, humble, undisturbed. Her rented room above the auto shop had a faulty heater and only one working outlet, but she kept it tidy, with old postcards of national parks taped to the mirror and a shoebox of medals hidden beneath her bed. They weren't hers. They belonged to her grandfather, Sergeant Willard Carter, Korean War, 2 Bronze Stars, a limp he never explained, and a silence that raised her better than most words could. He taught her how to fix a loose hinge, how to look people in the eye, and how to hold your ground even when no one thanks you for it. When he died, she didn't cry in public. She lit a candle, paid the rent, and picked up an extra shift. That's what he would have done. That's what she did. At the diner, no one asked about her life. The manager barked. The customers grunted. One regular always left nickels and called her honorable. No one knew her last name, but she remembered theirs. She noticed when the dishwasher came in with bruised arms, when the retired trucker stopped smiling after Tuesday. She remembered who ordered rye toast, who never finished their coffee, and who always looked down when asking for a to-go cup of water. And so, on a Tuesday thick with rain, when the bell above the door rang, and a man limped in soaked to the bone, coat tattered, leg dragging, head bowed like he was asking permission just to breathe, Emily Carter noticed. Long before anyone else looked up, she already knew something was about to change. The plate hit the tile floor with a crash so loud it silenced even the hiss of the fryer. Chicken and dumplings, still steaming, splattered across Emily's shoes, gravy dripping down the counter like spilled shame. Frank Doyle stood above her, his thick hand still outstretched from where he'd slapped it from her tray. His face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but authority. "I told you," he barked, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We don't serve beggars here." The man she had fed, Raymond Ellis, sat frozen in the booth, his fingers still curled around the coffee mug, as if bracing for impact. Emily didn't flinch, not even as the room turned to ice. The retired couple by the window stared down at their menus. The dishwasher paused mid-swipe, then turned his back. A mother pulled her child closer, as if decency were contagious. No one said a word. No one stood. No one helped. Emily's apron was already damp from the shift, but now the food soaked into the fabric like a brand. She didn't wipe it. Didn't defend herself. She knelt slowly, picked up the empty plate, set it on the counter with deliberate care, and looked Frank straight in the eyes. Not with defiance. With something quieter. Deeper. A stillness that made his volume feel like a child's tantrum. "I paid for the coffee," she said, her voice low and level. "You can take it out of my tips." But Frank wasn't interested in money. He wanted obedience. And in front of the remaining handful of customers, he needed to prove a point. "You just made me look soft," he growled. "You think you can run this place? You want to be a hero?" Emily said nothing. She didn't blink. "You're fired," he snapped. "Pack your things, now." His finger jabbed toward the door, rigid as a commandment. Emily reached behind her back, untied her apron with calm hands, and folded it once before placing it on the counter. She didn't look around. Didn't wait for someone to object. Outside, the rain pounded harder, as if it too was angry. She walked past the tables, past the booth where Ray now sat, as still as a statue, his eyes glassy, the spoon untouched. He tried to rise, but his leg failed him. His mouth opened, but no sound came. She paused just briefly, just long enough for her fingertips to rest gently on the edge of the table. Not to reassure him, but to anchor herself. At that moment, a teenage girl near the door lowered her phone. She hadn't looked away. She hadn't spoken either. But the way her eyes met Emily's, steady, uncertain recording, held something different. Not pity. Not shock. Just the quiet promise that someone was watching. Emily stepped into the storm, canvas shoes soaking through in seconds, hair clinging to her forehead, hands trembling not from fear, but restraint. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. Not yet. And inside, as the bell above the door gave its final chime, the silence left behind wasn't just awkward. It was indictment. The kind that doesn't need a verdict. The kind that's already been seen. The rain hadn't stopped. It had only changed its rhythm, from a wild assault to a steady, deliberate pounding, like 1,000 quiet knuckles tapping the windows of the town that hadn't yet woken up. Inside Doyle's diner, the air was thick with burnt coffee and unsaid things. Frank had returned to his post behind the register, arms crossed, jaw clenched, pretending not to hear the silence clawing at the edges of his authority. The seat where the old man had sat was now empty, save for a napkin folded with the care of a soldier and a half-drunk cup of black coffee cooling by the minute. But no one noticed the first black SUV, or the second. It wasn't until the third one parked, wheels aligned like formation boots, that the old waitress near the pie display looked up, brow furrowed. A fourth vehicle came, then a fifth. Engines cut in perfect unison. The town's usual morning hum. Delivery trucks, distant radios, idle gossip, fell mute. Something had shifted. When the door opened, it didn't creak. It didn't jingle. It surrendered. A gust of cold air swept in. And standing in the frame was a man who made the floor seem straighter. The walls seemed tighter. The space seemed suddenly too small to contain him. Colonel David Ellis didn't need a nameplate or salute. He wore his years of service in the way his back refused to slouch, in the precision of his step, in the silence that followed him like a loyal second. His uniform was dark, pressed sharp, his boots polished to a shine that caught the overhead lights like the glint of steel. His jaw was set. His gaze, steady, unreadable, swept the room once and landed on the counter. Frank Doyle froze. The colonel didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm forward. He stepped inside with the grace of a man who had marched through dust storms, through minefields, through bureaucratic ambushes and real ones alike, and had never once lost his footing. "I'd like to speak to the owner," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut through the diner like a bell toll. Frank's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I'm the owner." The colonel nodded once. Slow, controlled. Behind him, the door remained ajar, framing the row of SUVs now lined like sentinels, shadows of uniformed figures beginning to gather just beyond the glass. The few customers inside sat frozen, coffee cups halfway to lips, forks midair. One man slid his phone slowly out of his pocket. A woman by the window reached for her husband's hand. No one knew exactly why they felt afraid, but they did. Colonel Ellis stepped forward, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. He took off his cap. And then he said the words that cracked the world open. "My name is Colonel David Ellis, son of Raymond Ellis." Silence didn't follow. It bowed. Frank Doyle's breath hitched before he could hide it, just a flutter in his throat. But in a room that's silent, even that was loud. Colonel David Ellis stood across the counter from him now. Nothing between them but a faded formica surface and decades of choices they couldn't take back. Behind the colonel, the door remained ajar, rain whispering against the frame like distant static. Outside, uniformed figures held position like carved statues, unmoving, unblinking, bearing witness. Frank's jaw twitched. He folded his arms tighter, forced a crooked smile onto his face like armor made of denial. "This is about that little drama yesterday," he muttered, voice laced with performative boredom. "I've already explained it. Rules are rules. We're not a shelter. I didn't know the guy was your whatever." The colonel didn't move. He didn't blink. He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded, laminated document. The edges worn, the seal still bright. He set it down on the counter, flat, the Silver Star citation. And next to it, with reverence that felt louder than any shout, he placed a weathered dog tag. "My father," Ellis said. Each syllable sharp and clean. Carried 12 men on his back through enemy fire in Fallujah. He didn't stop, not even with shrapnel in his leg, not even when the medics told him to. He refused treatment until every one of them was safe. "One of those men was me." The words didn't tremble. They struck, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Frank chuckled, but it faltered halfway through. "Look," he said, glancing sideways as if hoping someone, anyone, might back him up. "I didn't recognize him. How was I supposed to know? He looked like every other street bum that comes crawling through." Ellis didn't let the sentence finish. He didn't raise a hand. He just leaned in, so slightly that only Frank felt it, and said, "That street bum is the reason you're standing here with both legs. And yesterday, you threw him out for being hungry." Frank opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Ellis reached again into his coat. This time he pulled out a phone, turned it, pressed play. The screen lit up with grainy footage. The diner, the crash of a plate, Emily standing tall, soaked in food, unwavering. Frank's voice echoed from the phone like a ghost come back to accuse. "We don't serve beggars here." And then, "You're fired. Pack your things." The sound of his own cruelty filled the space like smoke. Behind the colonel, the townspeople who'd gathered at the door now stood shoulder to shoulder, phones in hand, eyes fixed. No one spoke. No one breathed. Frank's face twitched again. The confidence that had bolstered his smirk just moments ago now sagged under the weight of so many eyes. He stepped back, just an inch. But it was enough. Enough for everyone in that room to see. He finally understood. The video kept playing. Each word, each insult, each command, echoed across the diner like a confession made under a spotlight. Frank Doyle's voice, captured raw and unfiltered, lashed through the silence louder than any siren. "We don't serve beggars here. You're fired. Pack your things." By the time the footage ended, the room had changed. Not just in temperature, but in weight. You could feel the floorboards holding their breath. The teenager who filmed it stood near the doorway now, phone lowered, gaze steady. Behind her, others had gathered. Locals, strangers, bystanders. All watching, all listening. None of them moving. Frank's shoulders had sunk an inch, maybe two. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, to spin it, to claw back control. But no words came. He reached for a napkin, wiped an invisible spot on the counter, avoiding everyone's eyes. Colonel Ellis didn't press. He didn't need to. Truth, once exposed, didn't need help burning. He simply stood there, unmoving, the folded silver star citation still resting between them like a verdict. From behind the colonel, another figure emerged, tall, lean, in uniform, with a calm face and steady stride. It was Lieutenant Herrera, from the Veterans Affairs Liaison Team. She stepped forward, not with threat, but with certainty. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. "We've been searching for Raymond Ellis for over a year," she said. "He was flagged as a high-priority veteran in need of medical care and housing. He fell through the cracks. Until now." Her voice cut clean through the fog that had settled over the diner. Frank's hands twitched. I didn't know who he was," he stammered, voice smaller now. "You can't expect me to treat every homeless guy like—" He stopped. Not because he was done, but because the crowd had shifted. Eyes once curious were now hardened. A woman near the pie case whispered to her husband, "We were here. We saw. We said nothing." The busboy near the sink looked down, shame written across his cheeks like grease stains. Even the cook, who'd barked orders through clouds of steam just hours ago, stood still, spatula hanging at his side. No one moved. No one defended. Not anymore. Lieutenant Herrera reached into her coat and held up a thin folder. Documentation, photos, reports, proof of everything Raymond had endured and survived. "This man," she said, her voice quiet, firm, "earned the highest respect our country can offer. And yesterday, you threw him out like garbage." Frank's knees didn't buckle, but he leaned heavier against the counter, as if his spine could no longer carry the weight of his choices. There was no applause, no outrage, just silence, the kind that judges. Then, slowly, Colonel Ellis reached out and closed the folder. He didn't look at Frank. He turned to leave. And that's when it happened. Frank Doyle, once loud, once untouchable, took one halting step forward and bowed his head. Not out of understanding, not out of regret, but because for the first time he realized no one was standing with him anymore. He had power once, but in that moment, all he had left was a silence no one tried to fill. The door to the diner swung slowly shut behind Colonel Ellis, and with it, the last echo of confrontation faded. But the silence didn't leave. It lingered, thicker now, heavier. Not with tension, but with something else. Realization. A woman near the window, who earlier had whispered behind her coffee cup, now stood frozen, her hands clutching her purse a little too tight. Her husband muttered, "We should have said something," under his breath. The cook stepped forward, towel still slung over his shoulder, and picked up the untouched cup of coffee that had sat steaming in front of Raymond Ellis. He didn't speak. He just wiped the rim, then poured a fresh one. At the counter, a young server, barely 20, freckles on his cheeks, walked over and slid a clean cloth napkin where the dog tag had rested. No words. Just a gesture, small but reverent. Then, almost reluctantly, he looked up at Emily, and gave a single nod. The busboy, who had been hiding in the back, came forward and placed a slice of pecan pie on the table. No receipt, no explanation. His face was red. His eyes didn't rise above her apron. "Ma'am," he said, voice cracking. "My granddad served too. I didn't know who he was. I'm sorry." Emily didn't answer right away. She simply reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the rusted dog tag still warm from her skin. Her other hand brushed lightly across the hem of her apron, as if smoothing the weight of everything that had happened. And then, with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard, she said, "He never asked for respect. He just gave it. That was all. No sermon. No demand. Just a truth laid gently at their feet." Outside, the line of veterans had not moved. Their formation remained, shoulders squared, boots aligned, back straight, as if holding the memory of the moment in place for just a while longer. Some in the crowd removed their hats. Others stepped back. And somewhere, someone began to cry, not loudly, but like a leak in something too long pressurized. As the colonel reached the final step outside, he paused and turned. Not toward Frank Doyle, who now stood behind the counter like a ghost of his former self, but toward Emily, toward the woman who hadn't shouted, hadn't begged, hadn't demanded anything, and yet somehow reminded them all of who they were. He offered her a salute, not the crisp, practiced kind from parade grounds, but the kind you give to someone who's fought a war you never saw. Emily didn't return it. She didn't need to. She simply looked toward the window, where the flag outside fluttered in the breeze like it, too, had been listening. Inside, the diner stayed open another hour, not because anyone wanted food, but because no one quite knew how to leave. Coffee was poured. Chairs were straightened. No one raised their voice. No one broke the spell. And when Emily finally walked out into the cold light of morning, with the dog tag still pressed to her chest, and the wind tugging gently at her coat, a little boy stepped out from the sidewalk crowd and held up a paper bag. Inside, a cookie tied with string. "My dad said you helped a soldier," he whispered. "So, I wanted to help you." Emily knelt down, took the bag with both hands, and smiled. "This place used to feel like home," she said softly. "Maybe it can be again." The neon sign at Doyle's Diner never lit up again. Its last flicker came weeks after the silence settled, swaying slightly in the breeze before going dark for good. Open 24 hours, faded into sun-bleached memory behind the dusty glass. Inside, menus stayed open, salt shakers half full, and the coffee machine cold. It wasn't abandoned. It was left still, like a church after the sermon, waiting for what came next. Across town, in a former vending machine warehouse, light returned in a different way. The windows were scrubbed clean. The bricks got a coat of soft, white paint, and above the entrance, a simple wooden sign had been carved by hand. Ridge Field, Community Kitchen. No spotlight. No slogan. Just warmth. Emily Carter didn't apply for the job. She was given the key. The nonprofit veteran group found her not through a resume, but through whispers. Quiet stories of the waitress who stood alone and didn't bend. They offered her the role without fanfare, and she accepted the way she did everything, quietly, completely, without ever asking, "Why me?" The tables were filled quickly. Former soldiers, single mothers, teens with headphones, and nowhere else to be. No one was turned away. The menu changed daily, but the feeling didn't. It was safety. It was something close to sacred. She still wore her apron, still opened early, still tied her ponytail tight. But now, students from the local high school volunteered to sweep the floor. A retired mechanic fixed the freezer. A Marine dropped off a sack of homegrown tomatoes. Every Thursday, the only photo on the wall was framed in simple oak. Raymond Ellis, standing in the rain, hand on his chest, and Emily by his side. "What?" "Raymond," never told the story. But somehow, everyone knew it. A teenager made a video. A teacher shared it with her class. A veteran wrote a letter that was pinned to the kitchen corkboard, next to a drawing of a soldier holding a spoon instead of a rifle. Raymond showed up once in a while. Not always. Not predictably. But when he did, voices softened. Phones were put away. No one interrupted. He didn't speak often, just nodded, sipped from a ceramic mug, and sat in the back like a witness to something still unfolding. The old dog tag still hung from his neck, dulled, but never hidden. One day, a boy, no older than 8, approached with a cookie wrapped in string. "Do you think Mr. Ellis remembers me?" he asked. Emily smiled. "I'm sure he does." Nobody clapped. No one needed to. The story lived in the space between gestures. And when someone asked why the flag outside the kitchen never touched the ground, a janitor whispered, "Because he walks through here." No one needed to ask who. The town didn't change overnight. But storefronts were painted. Sidewalks swept. People started looking each other in the eye again. Not everyone spoke of that morning, but everyone remembered. Near the pantry door, there's a photograph you notice. Raymond, seated quietly at the end of a long table. No smile. Just watching. The dog tag catches the light. He's not looking at the camera. But somehow, it feels like he sees everything. They didn't meet at a monument or under waving flags. They met quietly, like men who had carried too much weight for too long, in a booth near the back of the Ridgefield Community Kitchen, where the light came in soft through slatted blinds, and the scent of simmered broth drifted gently from the stove. 2 mugs sat between them, one of coffee, one of hot water. A folded cap rested on the vinyl seat beside Raymond Ellis, his back straight, hands folded, eyes steady. Across from him sat Colonel Matthew Ellis, his son, not in uniform, not with posture, but with presence. They had no audience. No need for one. Outside, the world buzzed with after-school chatter. Tires over damp pavement. Birds restless in late autumn skies. Inside, time thickened like molasses. Every sound was small, sacred. The hum of the fridge, the soft scrape of a chair leg, the gentle clink of a spoon against ceramic. Matthew spoke first, voice quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening. "You okay, old man?" Raymond's lips didn't move at first, only the smallest crease near his eyes. "Didn't think I'd be needed again." Matthew looked down, then met his father's gaze. "You never stopped being needed. I just forgot how to say it." There was no apology. No speech rehearsed in the car. Just that sentence. And the silence after it, which meant more. Raymond reached out, not toward the cup, but toward the cap beside him. He turned it slowly in his fingers. Soft fabric. Frayed edges. The stitching faded but intact. It wasn't a relic. It was memory you could wear. Matthew slid a small object across the table. A tarnished dog tag on its chain, coiled like a question. She kept it. Said you gave it to her like it still meant something. Raymond's fingers closed around it. He didn't nod. Didn't speak. But the way his shoulders lowered, just slightly, said everything. A song began to play from the far corner. A record, old, grainy, familiar. Piano first, then trumpet. A melody from a war neither of them had spoken of in years. Neither one reacted, but they both heard it. Matthew glanced out the window, watching a boy toss pebbles at a street lamp, trying to hit the metal pole. His breath fogged the glass. "You ever think we just disappear?" he asked. Raymond didn't answer for a long time. Then, simply, "Not if we leave something behind." No one said what something meant. It didn't have to be named. They sat like that for a while. 2 mugs, 2 dog tags, 1 silence, and when it was time, they stood together. No handshake. No hug. Just a quiet rising, side by side. And as they stepped into the hallway light, Matthew reached once, briefly, placing a hand on his father's shoulder, not to steady him, but to say, "I'm here now." That was all. That, and enough. It started slowly, not with headlines or ceremonies, but with whispers, gentle, persistent, impossible to ignore. The story of what happened at Billy's diner rippled through Ridgefield like morning light spilling over the hills. It passed from table to table at the local barber shop, folded into quiet conversations over chessboards at the senior center, and echoed in the hallways of the middle school, when a teacher paused her history lesson to say, "Sometimes, the bravest act is simply to see someone." At the town library, an 8th grader printed out a screenshot of the saluting soldiers and taped it to the inside of her locker. At Ridgefield High, a group of juniors raised the flag with unusual care, straightening its edges, stepping back in silence after it caught the wind. And at the church down the road, a deacon adjusted the veterans' memorial plaque to make space for one more name. They didn't know if Frank Delaney would want that, but they knew he deserved it. Frank never spoke about that day. Not once. He returned to his routine with the same quiet precision that had defined his life for decades. Early mornings, simple meals, careful walks. But others spoke. A boy at the diner had filmed the salute. His mother uploaded the clip to Facebook with a single caption, "For those who never stopped serving." Within a week, it had been viewed over 1 million times. The town didn't build him a statue. They didn't rename Main Street or hold a parade. But in the weeks that followed, things shifted. Teenagers began helping carry groceries for older neighbors, without being asked. A young man at the hardware store started checking in on a Vietnam vet who used to sit alone by the paint aisle. And once a week, without fail, a new face would knock on the door of the community kitchen and ask, "Is Mr. Delaney here?" "I just wanted to say thank you." Matthew noticed it too. At the base where he was stationed, he heard whispers from cadets, ones who'd never met Frank but carried his name like a compass. "My dad showed me the video," one said. "It made me want to serve for the right reasons." Another, quieter still, "I haven't spoken to my grandfather in years. I think I'll call him." No one said Frank was a hero. No one had to. They just nodded when his name came up, like they were acknowledging something sacred and still unfolding. One afternoon, a local teacher asked her class to write about someone who embodied dignity. Over half the papers began the same way. "There's a man in town you may not know." And on a windowsill at the community kitchen, the sun caught the edge of a framed photo, Frank in uniform, younger but unmistakable, standing tall beside his unit. A boy, waiting for his shift to start, paused, looked at the image, and stood just a little straighter. The flag outside stirred in the breeze. And the story kept traveling, quiet, steady, unstoppable. And on the wall of Ridgefield Community Kitchen, just above the coffee station, hung a frame. Simple, wooden, unpolished. Inside it, a folded flag, one silver star, and a weathered dog tag that had once rested in Clara's apron pocket. No spotlight. No plaque. Just sunlight pouring through the window, landing on it at the quietest hour of morning, like the town itself had learned how to honor, not with noise, but with stillness. Frank never spoke much after that. He didn't need to. Sometimes he'd sit by the window, one hand resting on Smokey's back, the other holding his coffee steady as young volunteers rushed past. When a boy once asked him, "Was it worth it?" he looked up, slow and sure, and said, "Only if you remember why." And in that silence, no applause, no fanfare, something lasting took root. If you felt something tonight, if this story reminded you of someone worth remembering, leave one word below: dignity. And if you still believe that quiet courage matters, then stay with us. Because here, we keep those stories alive.